connecting to the cloud stuff, and now I'm recording. And Lazo, do you have any thoughts before I bounce into it properly?
Actually, I think something that we can inspect quite closely is the psychology of fear, because it's relevant for multiple reasons. One is the obvious one of how you can manipulate the masses through fear, through actually get them to be terrified, and then they're more easily controlled. That's also like a very basic sales principle, by the way. When you put the customer in a hole, kind of accentuate and really trigger their fears, and try to paint a picture about what happens if your product won't, if they don't get your product. Now, they are also right now selling you something. Again, this is not some kind of a speculation on where this is coming from. Just in general, the communication is very fear-based. And also what you mentioned, Sam, is brilliant, because people in general in this universe are afraid. Even religion itself is kind of a response to that, of how to make sense of your existence, because you are in this vacuum, in this darkness, and without God, you need to rely on something. And you can see this all over the place. Even if you think about just diets, that's why people don't really accept the new revelations of diet. Like, for example, something simple like the cholesterol myth. It's really hard to accept, because with that, a lot of other things go. Your trust, for example, in the medical establishment goes out the window. And this is where you can see this, very religious behavior. And when you want to engage your friends, your family, or anyone really, you need to take that into consideration. So maybe we can also investigate it a little bit in the 100%. Remainder of the conversation.
100%. I think that was something we'll definitely have to hit on in the end. But look, I'm going to rip into what Sam was talking. So enough of the suspense. We're up and running. Archetypes. Archetypes. Let's start ripping into archetypes. The archetype of the church. Let's get into that a little bit. So what Sam was bringing up is the idea that people will blindly trust the authority. And there's this weird synonymous nature of an unquestioning bowing at the feet of the lab coat is the exact same as many people would have unquestionably bowed at the feet of the priest. It's the same psychological pattern. Just switch out the characters, you've got the exact same pattern. The priest, you ask the priest what you should do, and the priest will tell you just do this, and you will blindly do it, this type of thing. And the institution the priest represents, like, think about it this way: the priest was the one who controlled the university and all that stuff, and he had absolute power over the entire European continent, above even the political realm. It was almost like a different realm. It was like the realm of the mind, as you'd understand. If you want to really understand this, think of the old Indian caste system, where you'd have the Brahmins, the intellectuals on top. Then you'd have the warriors, who would be like the kings in the middle. They would be like the political rulers. And so what you have to really understand is that these priests were above this. So think of the Catholic Church. Catholic means universal. Universal means above states. So the Catholic Church ruled France, England, Ireland, Germany. Beyond that, it was superordinate. It was huge. And they did it through these very interesting institutions, which were these churches that popped up everywhere. And everybody, think of the life of someone 700 years ago. They'd farm, and then they'd go to the church and get their information, and that would form their mind. And then these people were like the priests, were like the doctors, the psychologists. They were all blended together. Like, confession is a form of psychology. It's a form of psychotherapy, if you will. They were the psychologists. They were the medicine men. They would, cast out demons. They would have knowledge. They were the most educated people. They were the experts. They were the authority. So they were the archetype of the authoritative shaman healer in the corner. And they would go, and that would formulate their worldview. And so this institution, this massive global institution, was unbelievably big and powerful. The church had just so much power, it was unbelievable. And it was spread all across Europe, as I was saying. And if you take this analogy and just look at the modern day, as we said, the same psychological bowing goes towards these experts that show up on a very, very similar institution. Where do people go to get their information from? They would go to things like the media, perhaps. They would turn on the TV. That's almost like walking into the church. Turning on the TV is a very, very similar behavior. It's like you're going to sit down and get entranced with this information. And it starts to show, like, I'm not sure if you've seen these videos. These are scary videos where people will put these videos up on YouTube to get pulled down, where you'll have newsreaders in Australia and England and America and Ireland and Germany all saying the same sentences, not just the same words, the same sentences. you know, with even the same cadence and all this. And it shows that there's this massive unity of opinion. And there's this a TV show called Father Ted, which they have a joke called the ecumenical opinion, the church approved opinion, this type of thing, the institutionally approved worldview, the mainstream conditioned status quo correct way of seeing things, you know.
Like
And
the church's tone of the week or tone of the day when they would pray, you know, kind of has that same idea.
Exactly, that type of thing. And then what you start to see if you analyze the world you live in now, speaking of archetypes, is that this archetype is still here. We think that we've put past religion behind us. We've put all this stuff behind us. But it's clear that our nature has not been fixed. Therefore, we're attached to these same patterns, and something else has just replaced it. And so the Enlightenment, the idea behind the Enlightenment is that they were going to fight against the church because the church had become corrupt. It is not a institution you should trust. And oh, that's an echo. If anybody's perhaps got an echo from me or something like that, please try sort it out if you could. I'm not too sure. So this, and Luke said, wouldn't psychology be the modern version of Catholicism or the university? So it's not really like hear me, people? Hello?
You were breaking up pretty bad.
Yeah.
Just repeat, I guess, the last 30 seconds.
Okay, sweet. So basically, yeah, sweet. So basically the idea behind psychology is that it was a part of this giant institution. You can think of like the confession as like a part of the church, but also part of the church was the universities. They literally were a part of the church, you know? And so now we have the same situation where, you know, the news media is part of the church, the cathedral, if you will. The university is, the institution of psychoanalysis would be, of psychotherapy, perhaps even the institution of pharmacy, perhaps even the institution of Hollywood. You don't really know. It could be everything, because look at the unity of thought. Look what just happened now. It's this great exposure of this. There's so much happening in unison that shows almost like there's this Catholic, this universal opinion going on. It's almost like a shadow archetype that was there all along that we didn't realize we popped into. And so the reason why we think we're free of this is because of something called the Enlightenment. And the name of this type of thinking is called dark enlightenment, if you want to call shadow enlightenment. We thought we broke out of that pattern, but our psychology has not changed. So we were prone to falling into line with these institutions. Now, I'm making this sound very, very bleak and Orwellian. And there is a reason why we do this. Like, the unity of opinion is quite good in some sense. And the Catholic Church gives you this intellectual spine that actually protects you from psychological warfare. If you've watched, recommends that people go back to Christianity because it will protect them from radical things like communism and whatnot. And the church fought really hard against communism because it creates this like united worldview that's not crazy to destroy you. But obviously the God is dead thing caused us an immense amount of issue. And these guys, I'm not sure if it's like a conspiracy, but it's almost like this is the way the history was going, and people, the Enlightenment was going to happen and atheism was going to happen. And what really happened is there was just a collection of people who were innovative enough to take advantage of the changing times and put in place a new institution to capture all the minds together. And there's a possibility that like they're flexing right now for all we know. So that's the basic thesis. I'm not sure how well my speaker was for all of that, so I'm just going to pass it on to everybody and tell me, does anybody got any questions or any thoughts?
I mean, just to make it like more practical, like as an example, I think like you see the mass, they'll get like diverted. Like there'll be like a pseudo enlightenment. For instance, like say after like the 2008 crash, you saw like this massive like upheaval, like Occupy Wall Street. But that was sort of like a diversion at the end of the day. And like the media was like the alternative media back then, like on the far left, they would like feed into it. But when you actually look at it and you get kind of like black-pilled by the way finance actually works, you kind of realize that like the status quo, the people who were going against it, it was all like a diversion, right? Like the actual blame wasn't necessarily to be put on like the central bank. Like you would see all these conservatives, they would like rally against the Federal Reserve. There would be like, oh man, you guys are printing money. Like you can't do that. It's going to cause like massive amounts of inflation. But when you actually look like at how the bank works, the central bank like barely creates any money. It's all like the private institutions that loan money like into existence. It's not even like there's no reserves at the bank. You know, like there's like, so when people like think, oh, like we're finally enlightened, and they go like attack the central bank, it's actually like a diversion, and like the hidden power stays hidden, and it's like it creates this like piñata that everyone like sacrifices.
Yeah, it's an extremely intense idea because it's like all of our assumptions are that we are like the freest we've ever been, and we don't have any problems like this. We're completely liberalized and we don't have any institutions. Everything's decentralized. But in practice, it just doesn't look like that. And that's the very, very scary awakening. And the thing, the worst thing about it is that when you wake up to this, when you start to see these patterns and you start to talk about them, people will start to view you like a heretic, like the way the Catholic Church would in the 14th century. And it's not like they're open-minded as they say they are. They actually are like as intensely religious as a Christian would have been back at the peak of Christianity. And that can cause you to get like extremely isolated, and that's why so many people you see are getting censored and all that. Like maybe there's a conspicuous side of that, or maybe it's just literally the natural conclusion of heresy, you know. So any thoughts on this? Because there's a couple of angles I can take on this that might bridge into what Laszlo wants to talk about. There's a lot of
just like a quick note on this, you mentioned isolation, which is a real threat, but also what I'm starting to notice is that obviously there's a lot of like social pressure now directed towards people who are dissident. So I think also something to be very wary of, and we can talk about later, you know, how to actually do that or how to be resilient, because just like you don't really notice that you're still subject to the same psychological patterns that we were before the Enlightenment, that's also true that it's really easy to fall into groupthink, you know, especially during a time like this. And I think one danger, yes, is to be isolated, but I really think that there is a way through it, you know, when you can still stand your ground and still have your own opinion and still not be like a social outcast. And the way through it is to be resilient towards social pressure. So just another maybe an angle we can take later on too.
Yeah. It's like let's go pro Jesus here for a second. Like Jesus is basically saying to you, look, they'll probably kill you for going against the group, but that's the price for owning an individual experience. So sorry, dude. There's a bit of a black pill. Like
you busted me. I was just I was just smuggling some Jesus there. But yeah, I mean, it is implied that you need to take the risk of being crucified. You know. That's the point I was going to make, really.
Can I throw a thought in there, Steph?
Sure. Is this going to be about Jesus? Yeah, go on.
Suddenly Neil has an idea.
No, I think I mean it leads back to Jesus, like everything does, obviously, but it's the idea of the individualism as an idea has been profoundly damaging to our progress, I think, as a culture. And the part of that which is often not understood is if you look at a sphere like science, we've taken science and almost democratized it, right? So if you look at the progress of science, it's always been through great men, right? So you have your Johannes Kepler, and you have your Copernicus, and you have your Newton, and you have your Einsteins, and these guys who perceived better than anyone else the nature of reality, and they were able to advance science through their particular genius. But now that we have spread science as though it is a consensus-driven progress, no longer do these great men have a voice. And you could extend that same idea into pretty much every sphere. So like, even if you're looking at philosophy, well, part of the issue is that, you know, you're not Jesus and you're not Nietzsche, not you particularly necessarily. I'm just saying in general that you have everybody saying, I have the right to be as great as anybody else, and therefore I need not listen to anyone. So we as a collective have decided philosophically this is right. When you buck that, you're actually attacking my personal greatness. And I think that's a very big part of what's going on as the problem. It's even less a conspiracy than it is a almost democratic vote for personal greatness, and an attack on anything that might condemn it.
That's an excellent point to point out, is that like with the Enlightenment, proposed that we all have the angelic soul, and that's what Christianity was all about. But the whole God thing, you can kind of just like brush that off, because we've distilled what Christianity really meant out of it, and now we can roll ahead with it. And so this is precisely this idea of dark enlightenment, is because you can think of it like Jungian terms, the shadow. All right, so we come with this first principle, is that we're all individuals, and if we all get together, we'll make rational decisions. And I've talked at length of how psychologically that's not how things work at all. And so you go with that first principle, and obviously the shadow of that first principle is that we think we're all individuals, and we're probably the most collective we've ever been, maybe in 400 years or something like that. Like, we're extremely collective now at this point. And it's like, you know, a collection of individuals, that type of thing. We're all like chanting on that type of stuff. And it becomes an immensely difficult problem, because the only way out of it, I think Jung has nailed this correctly, the only way out of it is personal development, in the fact that if you get in touch with what your heart and soul and own original experience is, as represented through Christ, hence why Christ is the most important archetype, no matter what you believe, of the Western soul. You need to get down to that, because that is fundamentally what's going to free you from the mob, basically. And we're in that situation where we... Yeah, we think we're free from the mob, and we're not. We're a part of it, and so it's a scary thought, because you don't. There's a reason for this. That this is an extremely intense idea that I'm going to present now, and this is known as the leftward drift. Cthulhu always drifts left. Now, if you read Nietzsche, Nietzsche will give you the best challenge you can possibly have against Christianity, for the reason that he can turn around and say Rome was really firm, strong, ruthless hierarchy, and it preserved excellence over equality. But there's a problem, because the collective, the group, the mob, the slaves, if you want, the mass of people that run this hierarchy are more powerful when they team up together. And their values are not excellent. Their values are actually kind of like, you know, the crab in the bucket values. They'll destroy Rome instead of accepting that they're not good enough. But their values are equality, but their values will collectivize very, very easily. It happened in Russia, it happened in the French Revolution, and it happened in Rome. And what happens is the collective comes together and chooses equality to pull down the excellent and destroy them. And so the thesis that Nietzsche presents is that Christianity formed the intellectual power for them to do that. Now, think about this. Jesus comes and says, the meek shall inherit the earth. And that's precisely what that means. Now, we can turn this into a nice little conspiracy, being like the Christians ruined Rome. And maybe that's true. But there's also another way you can look at this that is quite interesting, is that Jesus comes and says, the meek shall inherit the earth, suggesting that, okay, it'd be cool if we keep Rome together, you know, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. But the reality that's going to happen is that the group are going to have to get dignified. You need to take care of the group. The community has to matter. You can't form this like ruthless hierarchy, or you're not really going to get anywhere, because you're just going to like put a load of the slaves down, and it just doesn't work long term. So if you want to build a stable society, why don't you give everybody a bit of dignity within this? Why don't you have, like, maybe humble your arrogance a bit and try to organize a society? And so what happens is Christianity is a sort of communist left-wing movement, but it's not incorrect. It turns out to be a very, very smart innovation when it gets up and running properly, and especially when it blends with the ambitious Germanic spirit. Now, the thing is that that leftward drift is what we saw from Rome, from the ion of Rome. You go into the ion of the Christian world, and that works, and it takes over the whole world. The meek did inherit the world. He was correct. You know, Big J got it right. And then what happens is that thesis does not stop. This is very close to what Jung was suggesting in Ion, is that you know, Antichrist and Christ open up, and the leftward drift works. And now we kind of went through the Enlightenment, and now things are starting to happen in a different way, where we keep drifting left. We just keep going. And what happens then is you have the most left-wing movement of all, which is atheistic communism, coming up. And it's anti-Christian. Christianity is now the establishment, and it's trying to pull down Christianity so that it can create the Marxist utopia of equality and whatnot. And this is big history. It's a very, very complex and difficult idea to see, but it's one of the best ideas you can ever see and understand for your current reality, because that's the one you live in. What seems to be going on is that there's a lot of right-wing reaction against this natural trend. The world is moving left. To give you a better example, the French Revolution was a left-wing movement, and what happened is the society collapsed, and then people like Napoleon came along and imposed tyrannical order for the people. You know, this is sort of the nature of this morality, the tyranny of the majority, this type of thing. And so we're going through something like that now. Like, and this is the most radical idea you could possibly say, because this is describing a way of looking at the world that is very heretical. Is that we seem to be ruled by the consensus of the majority to empower sort of the Napoleonic tyrants at the top. That type of, maybe you could say the super capitalists or something like that. The people who have just so much money that they're just completely unaccountable. And their way of ruling, think of like Brave New World, is to give the majority their pleasure, their individuality, these very, very nice things, you know, give you your identity politics, if you will, and all that stuff. Give them all that stuff. Make it seem like it's for them, and then sort of secretly take over and the top and whatnot. And
it's bread and circus.
Is what, sorry?
Bread and circus.
Bread, exactly. Bread and circus taken to
the
Say again?
Oh, panem et circenses. I just said it in Latin to sound cool.
Oh, yeah. And this is something you can sit down and kind of think about a lot. Like, it's if you look around what's going on, like the right-wing reaction, Jordan Peterson included in this, is that thing where people are waking up and being like, wait a second, what the fuck is going on? People are like, the left is so powerful. And why do conservatives always lose? Like, think about it this way. Like, you've probably heard this before, but you know, the modern conservatives are like, you know, taking up the gay lobby, and they're like, you know, we're the Democrats are the real racists, and we're the real pro-gay people, and all this stuff. And it's actually them taking on left-wing values in a sense. Whereas 40 years ago, you kind of would have got the feeling that they'd probably be like, no, we're not really into that gay thing at all. No, we don't want gay marriage. But that's completely drifted out of the picture. And some people say it's a conspiracy, but perhaps it's not. Perhaps it's actually the nature of the group moving towards these more liberal ideas. And it's a very confusing problem what you do about it. And so you see a lot of people react with very right-wing movements and whatnot. And look, I'm not here to suggest I understand politics or how to do all this, but I've thought about this a little bit, and I've kind of thought, maybe the reaction should not be a anti-liberal reaction, because that is literally reacting, and that's almost always feminine. Maybe you should actually look at stuff like, okay, by first principle, what is going wrong with them, and what could you do right? For example, these people it seems like they're exploiting the idea of individuality and making it ugly. Like the kind of, there's a lot of these movements don't have a good energy about them. They seem to be very ressentiment, as Nietzsche described. Perhaps there's an attitude you could take which is more assertive and positivistic. Perhaps you could actually take Christianity's premise and say, we've all got this creative human spirit, and we should focus universally on empowering that, a sort of left-wing idea, if you will. Everybody's equal in that they have this power in them, and we need to let it out. Maybe you could say everybody's vitality needs to be released, whereas this other present force right now is suggesting that vitality is evil. That's literally what it's turning into. And I think when you start to look at the world that way, or perhaps the way I'm looking at the world, it does offer you quite a comprehensive solution to the problem, in that you don't need to dive into ideology too much, even though you can. But you still get to maintain your individuality, and you don't have to do stuff that dismisses the natural tendency that the world seems to be going towards. So there's just a couple of thoughts on that. I find this stuff very interesting. If anybody has any ideas, like, rip into it by all means.
Yeah, let me just drop in with a few thoughts, because we mentioned so many things. And so you mentioned Jordan Peterson. We had a Latin phrase dropped in there, and I just feel obligated to kind of drop in a little bit of correction with regards to the word meek, because Jordan Peterson raised this issue before, if you guys remember, if you followed him, that the word meek actually means something like someone who has a sword and knows how to use it, but he keeps its sheaths. And
integrated.
So this was, yeah, and this was kind of controversial. So let me just read something out. So the actual meaning of the word, the origin of meek in English, that comes from the Old Norse, mjúkur. And this means actually gentle. And through perhaps a fuller understanding comes from the Greek origin, which is praus, which is translated as strength under control. In ancient Greece, war horses were trained to be meek, strong and powerful, yet under control and willing to submit. Aristotle said that the praus person is one who has virtue of the mean between two extremes. If recklessness were on one end and cowardice on the other, prowess might be characterized as steady courage. For example, a meek person doesn't shy away from taking a stand. Rather, the stand is taken at the right time, with the right people, in the right way. He or she submits or constrains power for greater effect on self and others. By focusing on this word every day, we can find that there are all kinds of ways to apply it. I think actually the virtue of prudence kind of hits at least on some of the connotations of the word meek. And why it's relevant to Latin is because one of the reasons why Latin is such a beautiful language and it's still being taught, even though it's a dead language, is exactly that, because it's a dead language. It's not being influenced anymore. And one might think, for example, how the word meek, coming from the Old Norse mjukr, and Odin, I hope I'm pronouncing this properly here, it somehow got translated or transformed over the years to mean what it means now. And I don't know. I mean, English is not my first language, but when I hear meek, all I see is weakness, you know? And if you just look at the etymology and the word, everyone can look it up. It's just simply not true. That was actually one of the reasons why all my life I was actually kind of shying away from Christianity, because I found weakness disgusting. And that's just something that I think if we think about like revitalizing even the Christian thought or the Western thought, we need to see these things clearly. And it seems to me that being meek, standing your ground, not being stupid, because you can see right-wing thinking throughout history and where it led, because it was just simply fucking stupid. You know, maybe you could implement some meekness in the old traditional sense of the word. Just a few thoughts there.
And that's a good point, is that like as I'm trying to illustrate is that this is the Cthulhu always drifts left, the trend of history. And what that basically means is that you kind of do have to respect the masses, even if they're not as good as you. Christ gives a brilliant statement when he says, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. The leader will be the least among you. That's such a fucking good idea, because it moves you into a way of understanding that, like, oh my God, if I'm to lead the group, I must serve the group. You know, that type of idea. And that's the sort of left-wing ideal par excellence. It's like a good left-wing ideal is that you've got to protect the group. You've got to dignify everybody in the group, and you'll empower it. You'll bring the most out of them. And then the right-wing thing is that excellence has to be aimed for. And that's something the left massively loses. And so I guess if you were to talk about thesis and antithesis, that seems to be presenting itself right now, where you have excellence without any, like people's purity spiral out of it, to the other side of it, which is like equality without any will to the greatness or power at all. And if you could blend them two, you'd have something very, very profound and powerful. And so I think that the last thing I want to articulate. Actually, no, I'll ask a couple of questions because I've been ranting on a lot. Anybody got any thoughts? Anything they'd like to ask before I plow into what I want to say?
Well, just a minor.
No, go on. Sorry,
No, I was going to say regarding meekness, that sort of immense strength contained under this almost impossible humility. It kind of reminds me of this idea that, like, you know, Christ didn't begin his ministry until he was in his 30s. And what prompted him to start was the request of his mother, a simple request of his mother to give people some wine at a wedding. And it's like, here's this incomprehensible divine power waiting for his mom to tell him what to do. Like, come on, man, that's not alpha. I thought Christ was the alpha and the omega. But you see kind of that all these inversions contained in him through that meekness, and like, oh, I'm going to destroy the temple in 3 days. Little did they know he was talking about his temple, his body, which just completely baffles people. And it's just an interesting thing, you know, if you're Christian or not, it's just kind of an interesting thing to look at.
Yeah. And that's why they say that he was obeying for 30 years, ministered for 3 years, and then rose in 3 days, you know, that like that Holy Trinity in that sense as well.
Yeah.
One thing I did want to mention just quickly, sorry, Steph, and it was largely just to point back to what you were saying about this idea of left and right kind of coming together. I'm pretty sure, but back in the day, when the Roman emperors rode back into the city from a massive victory, they had a slave behind them telling them that one day that they would die. And I think as like a conceptual idea, that's actually really, really powerful, because you've got the emperor, which epitomizes right wing. You know, it's the hierarchy. It is the embodiment of the symbol of God. And then you've got the slave, which is the lowest of the low, reminding that all-powerful entity at the top that one day he will die. It's a reminder that he is, for the time being, the representation of the symbol, but not the symbol itself. And I think that then points to another thing, which is quite powerful, that if you really want to restart some kind of push against Cthulhu at the bottom of the ocean, that push needs to be it needs to have some kind of divine influence behind it, because if it doesn't, then you're just going to get overpowered by the fucking squid man, aren't you? Like, you've got to be powerful enough to push back against it, and that power has to come from somewhere that is divine, because no mortal man could push against him, because to look upon him drives you insane. So
yeah,
and,
good point. Nico.
Yeah, regarding the left versus right in Moldbug's terms and the Cthulhu swimming leftwards. So Moldbug says that in a society like Rome, there would be like a balance between left and right. So he says right wing, he defines right wing as being for order and for people, not only for excellence, but also people following up with their chores and duties, and left being for allowing them to rest and enjoy their lives. And in an ancient society like Rome, you'd have to have a balance between these two, otherwise you'd lead to ruin. But what was different in late medieval society and in modern society is people invented science and technology, and the left used that to kind of, drift leftwards without having to suffer the consequences immediately, and they can postpone them to future generations. And that's what technology does. It enables you to enjoy your life now and not worry about tomorrow. So that's why it kind of led to that drifting indefinitely to the left.
It's an interesting thing, actually, that you bring that up, because if you bring up Jordan Peterson's juxtaposing the order and chaos dichotomy in his biblical lectures, he rightly points that out in the stories of the flood contrasted with the Tower of Babel. And if you read Josephus, and he gives this account of the Jewish belief of the ideas that led to the Tower of Babel. They're not recorded in scripture, but it was accepted in the Jewish, you can say, their cultural interpretation of the events. And he talks, interestingly, he talks about Nimrod, this Nimrod character who he kind of riles up people's pride and their individuality to say, oh, well, we don't need God anymore. We survived the flood. We're all these excellent people. We speak one language, yada, 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 and which led to the construction of this hyper-order Tower of Babel. So it's kind of reminds me of the sentiments that we felt now post-Enlightenment, this idea that we can dispense with God and that we can kind of run free. So just an interesting thing to think about.
And
Go on.
that is kind of what we're experiencing now. You can look at a lot of things through the Tower of Babel and flood dichotomy, that you build up, and things become more uniform and more structured. But then the tower is struck down, and when the tower is struck down, people break apart, and then the other one is the flood, which is what we have right now. That would be like a natural disaster, which could be worsened by people's individual moral insufficiencies, and they kind of play off of each other. A flood comes, and then right now we're seeing possibly the Tower of Babel is falling due to the pressure.
Yep.
I wanted to say something about science that was mentioned before. I think Neil mentioned this, that science has been sort of democratized. This is actually a pretty weird modern conception, because we think that science is now about consensus, so that experts agree that this is so, but actually science has always been about breaking consensus. When Darwin came out with the theory of evolution, they drew caricatures of him as a monkey. And when actual scientists came with innovations, they were always the consensus was always against them. So there was a lot of battle with this stuff. So that's one thing. And the other is about education. Education, like I have a sort of complicated, let's say, relationship to it, because I think that education as we have it now basically trains you for groupthink. You're there, you're sitting in your little chair and you wait for the bell to ring, and when you have to go piss, you have to lift your hand up and ask politely if you can go piss. So basically you're trained almost like a dog to follow the group and respect the and ask the authority for permissions, stuff like that. So I think this influences a lot of you know, our culture, which holds itself as educated, but you know, maybe we're just trained, educated dogs in this sense. Not to sound too bleak, but you know.
Hermes, can I go piss, please?
You may.
Can I forward a thought on meekness?
By all means, yeah.
I just kind of struck by personal experience in regard to what strength under power looks like, because naked strength accomplishes very little. You know, when I went to Afghanistan in 2007, it was with naked strength. Killed a lot of people and changed nothing, right?
Yeah.
Certainly changed it for them, but fundamentally did not alter that culture in a meaningful way. It actually reinforced their strength as a culture. It reinforced their ideologies by forcing opposition against that which was destroying. And, you know, technology, for all of its power, has no power to change human will. We could nuke the world and it wouldn't make us less leftist. We'd just become more savage in the ruins of whatever was left, right? But, you know, there's this idea here that when we come in force, it's not going to change things. There's actually a meekness in the Roman model that we don't necessarily always recognize when we look at it, because we look at the brutality of Rome very often. We don't often perceive that the power of Rome was not its brutality, it was its restraint, that they would bring the legion out and go and slaughter, but then they would build the city and say, but you can be like us. And we will bring our Colosseums, we'll bring our amphitheaters, we'll bring our mighty architecture and Roman concrete and roads and trade, and you can join with us in what we have if you choose our ideology over what you had. And it was the meekness that made them able to hold power with actually relatively minor military strength, because it was in people's best interest not to rebel. And, you know, of course, Jesus as the example of meekness is very powerful. If you look at that symbol, that here's God, and rather than do what he could have done, and arguably you might say should have done, which is just destroy everybody rather than go to the cross, but he wouldn't have saved anyone for himself, right? So he had to die in order to make brothers out of those people who were his enemies. And then you look at the spread of Christianity, and the spread of Christianity was not a spread of conquest. It was a spread of submission, which grabbed a hold of people's hearts. And I think there we get some really good cues about what works and what doesn't, because we want to change the world. Like, I don't say this vainly, but I am a trained killer. I'm actually quite good at it. I'm an expert marksman. I have 28 rifles in my basement that are very good. And I could kill an awful lot of people that would make these mass shooters look like chumps. But it wouldn't accomplish anything. But if instead I enter the forum of ideas and I can try and craft a compelling narrative, and I think here is the problem with conservatism, is that they are not crafting compelling narratives. They've lost the soul of the people. They don't know how to communicate. They don't know how to bring these ideas forward in a compelling and real way that is felt. You know, so I have to think of the symphony, to think of what it is that moves people when they watch these silly Marvel movies, and say, what is it in this idea of sacrifice and triumph and greatness that really grabs a hold of people's souls? That's what I need. I need to get into the narrative, and I need to communicate how you can actually not just be right or left, but you can pick the third path. and here's my shill, you know.
I think one of the interesting things that you pointed to there, though, is why are people interested in the Marvel films? And then to tie that back into Rome, one of the reasons that people like the Marvel films is because they involve the concept of divinity. Like, one of the most popular characters is Thor. Rome was founded by Romulus and Remus, who themselves were demigods. Like, if you want to have a concept or an idea that someone can really get behind, you need to almost have the people who found that idea be so authoritative that you cannot question them. And I'm not saying that don't ever question authority, because it's generally a good idea, but one of the reasons that Rome was so successful is because when people looked at the people who founded it, they saw entities that were so above and beyond themselves that they admired them just for, you know, the way in which they existed. They didn't, you know, whereas now with this whole idea of multiculturalism, where we've got to try and make up these values of diversity and tolerance and all the rest of it, they're just buzzwords. They don't actually mean anything. Whereas when people were part of, at least as far as I understand it, when people were part of Roman society, there was something inherent in the concept of Rome that went above like mere words. I've not done a particularly good job of explaining that, but I think there's something there.
I want to latch on to that, because that's a great angle to kind of bridge into something Luke brought up actually about divinity, finding divinity, because okay, all of you said a lot of stuff that was great, and I actually really want to dig into fucking all of it down. But let me start from the end. So Sam's bringing up this notion of like the people attached to Marvel, because it's like superpowers and all this type of stuff, and they want to see something that's more powerful than themselves, that they can bow to in some sense. This is an interesting problem, because as we said, the Enlightenment was the transition into the sort of secular atheist reality. And what it did is, maybe this could be the weak point. This could be the point of actual contact that could ignite the fire that you need. And it's intellectual, it's not ideological. The Enlightenment sets that premise that what you are, like you, the you is the left-brained set of jargonized concepts, and that leaves you very vulnerable, because then you need to form the matrix in your head. And so what happens is the priests or the intellectuals or the academics, they can come in and they can populate, they can tell you which jargon is good and which jargon is bad, and then they program your mind into like whatever little brainwash piece of junk that you are, and then you get stuck in that. And then not only that, but you don't respect anything above that, because you think you as the individual you, rational you, left brain you, is the glorious meaning of the world. That's the fundamental purpose of reality, is that you are the entire heart beat, the God. You hear that so much now. You are the gods. We are the gods. We are now the gods that rule the world. We will change things and all that stuff. And I'm not like shilling against reason. I actually love rationality and reason. I think it's an immense tool, but there is psychological, neuroscientific proof now that that part of you is actually the little ego that Jung and Freud were describing, that has, and that literally sits like a boat inside something deeper and more powerful. And that deeper you, you know, as new age as this is going to sound, that deeper you, that thing that you have to open up, that access point, that world that Jung went into in the Red Book. You can call it if you want to give a materialistic take on it, call it the right brain. Literally a different world, a different portal, a different part of you, like the door between here and Narnia, that you go into the deeper part of you. That is actually a lot closer to what you would call your real personality, the source of your personality, your real life experience, your deep memories, your deep emotions. It seems to be where a lot of your profound feelings come from and whatnot. And you can actually offer that to people and suggest to them that the way they're operating in life is literally technically wrong, because they're putting their reason and ego on a pedestal, and that might actually be the thing that's holding them back. And that's a very, very interesting thought, because it does seem to undermine one of the most important first principles of the Enlightenment that does seem to deceive us the most. Our arrogance keeps us blind, because we believe that like, I don't know, this jargonite part of ourselves is the leader, the God. And if we're able to allow ourselves to bow, like it does suggest taking Jungian psychology perhaps a bit serious. I'm shilling for like the weirdest stuff today, but taking that serious, it does give you the opportunity to look at a program of some sort, like something that you can offer people in the same way as a religion would offer people, a way out of this stuff, a way to work with themselves and all that. Like, I'm not sure if Jung got it perfect. He definitely put out a good roadmap. I'm not sure if you should be careful in case you're like trying to start a religion, but you do see that there's something there. There is something to jiggling around with what we would call psychology, and there's something of immense value there that solves a really, really big problem. Now that's to address Sam, that I think is a brilliant point. And that gets even more interesting when you ask, like, you open the door to the unconscious and what's down there. That's when you start to get into like ion and stuff like this. And there's another very, very interesting thought that was coming from, I'm going to have to go back to Dave, because Dave or Hermes was talking about, he was talking about the education system and whatnot. And that is a similar situation where you have a thesis, and I've said this thousands of times before, so I'm just going to repeat myself, a thesis where you've got the little ego and the purpose of education is to program it to make it say the right things, input, output, conditioning, like you brought up, like the dog, whereas the correct thing might be to more say draw out. Educate in Roman times meant to pull out. And that is still, again, emphasizing this thesis that we're talking about. And then just to talk a little bit about Rome and meekness and prudence and whatnot, like this is a common misconception with Rome and Nietzsche and paganism and all this, is that they're not like anger religions, you know, they're not, that's not what was going on there at all. And the Romans looked at Achilles with scorn. They thought he was a brutal savage. They looked towards the idea of Minerva or Athena in preference to Ares, and Athena, strategy, long-term thinking, effeminate thinking as the best way to coordinate things, you know? So there's that side of things as well. These things need to be integrated. These balances are there. Hot-headedness, as Nietzsche said, would be the ruin of Europe. And actually he turned out to be correct. You'd think Nietzsche would be like, oh, go kill everybody. But he was like, guys, if these Germans don't control their temper, they're gonna cause serious problems, and they'll be taken advantage of by everybody around them. That's exactly what happened. He called it down to the nail, and he was simply saying we just need a bit of prudence in our culture, these type of things. And so we're in a much different situation now, where it does seem like all of this stuff has come to pass, and there's this huge tides of destiny, and it would be great if we could just clutch on to some idealized version of like pure left-wingism or pure right-wingism, and that would solve all the issues. Or, you know, go all into Jungian psychology, or go all into Jordan Petersonism or something like that. But it's never going to work that way. Jung and everybody is adamant to say that you live in history, and the best thing you can do is realize that wave, you actually have to learn to surf. And so our wave is that there's that Cthulhu has reached almost, well, it feels like a zenith. You know, it's like the world like Bolshevik movement or something like that is going on. There's this, you know, global equality movement going on, and as we said, it does seem to have and this is incredibly heretical, it does seem to have a negative tint to it. But the problem is, and this is all premised on the idea that what you are is these rational sets of jargon that you propose you are. Like, that's actually the psychological premise of the entire movement. Like, what you are is the transgender thing you propose you are, or the gay or straight, or the gender, or the identity, the ethnicity, whatever it is. And it's literally like leading with jargon. Just look at it. It's that obvious. And then if you take that universalist approach, nothing like extremely right-wing, just take the universalist approach, the exact same one, and propose it with the more complex view of your mind, saying that if you dug into yourself, you would find that there's a vital human spirit underneath that set of jargon creating left brain. You would actually get access to something that is universally saying, let's bring this out of people. And that actually turns out to be quite an interesting and revolutionary idea. Now, I've said that already, just to drill it to the end, and I'm like totally ranting now at this point. The problem does seem to be this idea of the cathedral notion, the idea that this thing has instantiated itself the same way as the church did. And all these machines, the media, the institutions, the academics and all that, that's not going anywhere. And that's where the power lies. And you have very little power relative to this. You may have the truth, but you don't have the power. And that's actually a terrible thing to realize, because you never want to actually be in that position. It's cool in the movies, but in reality, like, that means terrible things could happen to you. You're in a very vulnerable position and all that. But the answers could be the idea of setting up or encouraging the idea of new institutions, at the very least, of bringing that part of you out of it that this thing crushes, And that's the first good step, like the creative endeavor, literally, like, you know, tapping into the deep mind and bringing an artifact out and giving it to the world. That's the first step. And if you really do that well, institutions will start to form that are almost like counter institutions. The example Molbug suggested for this is that, all right, so in our time, it seems like this cathedral is getting stale and it's on the point now of something bad may happen. But like in Rome, those institutions, the Hellenic pagan institutions got stale, the church got stale, but the Catholic Church started to form in its seedling version back then. Imagine how small it seemed, but it grew into be what it turned out to be because it was based on correct premises. It exploded, you know, and we're probably in a similar position as that. Like, I'd love if we were going to be the guys who are going to take over the world and win and all that, but we might be in the situation where all artists are, where we have to, set the spark that grows into a fire, but we might never see the bonfire. And that's probably the hardest reality I think you can accept out of everything, is that it's Nietzsche's idea, like, you won't be the Übermensch. That's what he said at the end of Zarathustra. We will not be the Übermensch. We're merely a bridge and all that. And then to get it as practical as possible, like, that might be the great step. That might be the greatest achievement you could do for, you know, the people you care about and all that, is like offer them something that's not so incorrect in its understanding of humans as a digit that they can crush at will, and instead saying there's actually something immensely treasurable and powerful that we need to bring out of them. And yeah, there's just a boil rant. So any other thoughts, or what are you thinking?
I think
It reminds me of St. Augustine's channeling of all the different historical Roman currents, and then crowning it with the idea of Christianity being this way out into a new system, if you will. So I see that kind of what you've just described, Steph, about this kind of counter institution. I think Augustine did that with Catholicity as well. Anyway.
Yep, it's good. Yeah, I absolutely believe stuff like this went on, and yeah, absolutely.
I think
God has shown us the way.
About Molbug, one of the things that he talks about with people who fight against the cathedral is you've got two different types. I can't remember exactly what the name was that he gave them, but there's one that hits on one particular area. So you've got Margaret Thatcher. She made everything radically free market based. And then you've got others which are more similar to Trump, where they hit on a broader but not quite so deep level. So he's more of like a cultural phenomenon, whereas Margaret Thatcher was like boring right down onto the market side of things. And I think one of the best places that we could probably focus on hitting is the artistic sphere. Because when you look at the fine arts, especially in the UK, I'm not entirely sure what it's like internationally, but fine arts in the UK is now just become, it's so stale. You know, when you've got the likes of Damien Hirst, and I actually think one of the best people in the fine arts in the UK is Jenny Saville, because she hits both sides. She's got the technical skill of a Renaissance painter, but then she's also got the shock factor of a Damien Hirst with his cow cut in half in formaldehyde. But I think the arts is probably one of the best places that if we were going to attack anywhere in this kind of ossified cathedral structure, then that would be the place to attack. And I'm not even saying that we would be successful, but if you were going to cause some kind of fracturing in the overall structure of the thing, then that would probably be the place to go. But obviously, the problem with that is if you want to create an institution, I mean, this is just me thinking now, but when you think institution, you think Red Brick University, you think somewhere like the Saatchi Gallery or something along those lines. So obviously there's a financial involvement, but then there's also the technical involvement as well. You need people who are not only going to support you in order to pay the bills, to keep the lights on, to get people to come in and whatever, but then you also need the people who are going to produce artwork or, you know, animation or whatever it is that's actually going to make people stand there. And it's like Jordan Peterson said, people travel from all over the world to see Renaissance paintings. Now, are you going to approach your artwork with the arrogance of, I'm going to finish this painting and have hundreds of thousands of people come and see it and all the rest of it? So it's you're kind of in a catch-22 at that point. It's like, how exactly do you go about doing it?
Well, that's actually something I want to touch on as well, because like the video I did with Carl Jung Applied, where I talk about me trying to learn to sing, that was my problem, is that I was trying to learn to sing, to be like fucking, you know, Jeff Buckley and all that. And if you're in any way tried to be an artist, you realize you're just not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to go in with a goal, because then it turns into it. Actually, it can hurt you. Like it hurt me, you know. So if we all get together and be like, boyos, ideology complete. All right, let's sit down and let's you know, start the new Renaissance, and we'll call it boyoism and vitalism or whatever.
We're basically tickling each other's balls at that point.
Absolutely, and the thing is that it actually would lose touch with what precisely the first principle we're trying to address is, that if you get caught up with the almost like the left-brained intention, you'll actually get caught up in the malaise of the modern world. And in order for you to do this properly, it actually is about dropping all that. Like literally, think of it like the left-brain palace, and you have to walk out of the palace and go into the dream world and pull stuff out of the dream world and just present it to the world quite authentically, and then see what happens, and maybe even have a bit of faith that that's, you know, that place will bring results that will be profound. And I do believe it's true. Like, and I think that's something almost everybody can believe is true. It's just so intuitive and deep and realistic to the human spirit that it will start to bring the solutions and all that. And it kind of has to be unideological, you know, like it has to have that way. Like I do have a feeling, an instinctive repulsion towards some of the nonsense that's going on. And that's okay, because that's almost like instinctive and emotional, and that's like speaking from that level and all that. But it can't be too ideological. You get what I'm saying? Like it can't be too intent on that stuff. It must be something you discover. And so I guess the basic solution to that thing is to actually practice what we're preach, you know, take our own pill. Like, you know, LARP about the new institution all you want, but do it first.
Well,
and see what.
So this is the thing that I've been given a lot of thought recently. Is that one of the ways that we can go about avoiding ideology altogether is if we think, so like the only thing I can really talk about is art, because I love to draw, and there are particular ways in which you can teach anybody to draw. And I'm pretty sure that if we got Neil and a gang of us into a room, he could teach us how to kill someone in a day. I'm fairly confident that if he really put his mind to it, he could teach us how to kill someone in a day. So if we are going to create an institution, or if we want to have an impact on enough people so that the potential Caravaggios, the potential Goyas, and all these kind of people can actually appear, what we need to do really is distill the best way of teaching the kind of people we would like to see as the Übermensch. So, you know, if you're, so for me, for example, like one of the things I hate in fine art is that when you've got a painting on the wall that is, say, 10 inches by 10 inches, but the description that requires you to understand the painting is 12 inches by 12 inches, like at that point, you've completely defeated the point of making a fucking painting in the first place. Like, one of the reasons people go to see art is so that they don't have to fucking read anything. They want to sit there and enjoy the image. And I think there's something in that. It's a case of, like, if you want to have an institution where people learn to read, where people learn to write, where people, fucking hell, like with Neil, like where people learn to go there, this is how self-defense works. This is how you kill a man who's trying to break into your house. These kinds of things I feel are genuinely important. And if the Boyoversity is going to be anything, then it should be a place where people come to learn, but they come to learn the skill, not necessarily our ideas enforced upon them.
Yeah, one thing I want to say about this is, so when you look at Renaissance artists, you sort of see like almost like individual. There was Michelangelo, and here's Leonardo, and all of them. So, but the thing is, it wasn't like like a pop-up of just individuals coming out of nowhere. It was like a movement, and they were grinding their talents against each other and getting better with that. So a lot of these artists, they like knew each other. And it was also like with the Impressionists. So they're like diamonds in the rough, but then because they grind against each other, learn off of each other, and even compete with each other, they get, you know, polished and better. And we see the fruits of that today, I think. So
yeah, and that's a good point to something I've been feeling. Like, I don't think I'm like the fucking most excellent musician in the world, but I think some of my music's all right. And it does have a quite a unique tone to it in terms of like where the culture is and all that stuff. But I've noticed that like I'm pretty much out there on my own. Like I just don't find other people making art, perhaps with these, with even just an instinctive consciousness, a lot of what I'm talking about. But I actually believe that there's a lot of them out there. It's just that they have been so slighted by the established culture that they're struggling a bit to get the odd voice out and all that. And I'm kind of thinking that, like, over the next 10 years, assuming we don't all get chipped and stuck in some like that, that actually should start to pop up. And it will be one of those, as you're saying, it will be like it'll be a zeitgeist experience, I'd imagine. And it won't be something that we necessarily have to strategize too much. It's merely like, it's as Jung says, conscientiously do your work and they will come. Build it and they will come. That type of thing. I have great faith in that, and it is about procedurally being correct with dealing with our own heads. And with the biodiversity, like I don't want to put any pressure on that turning into something. Like I'm happy to talk to talented, like there's a lot of talented people here as it is, and I'm happy to just keep talking to this, getting the right energy out there. And I do think we'll just start to click into gear, So yeah, like absolutely, like these are some great thoughts. And I guess the last thing I want to just address to Sam perhaps is, as one thing I keep in mind is that skipping to the material building that we're all working in, again, this is a very hard thing, and it's a bit ego destroying, but we might not achieve that. Like maybe the best we'll be able to do is to offer a new story or a new energy on a very, very blunt level. And then that the institution will be for people later afterwards. And that's a really sad thing. Like it's really hard. But that,
I suppose it's one of those things, like when you make the conversation of, we need to make a new institution. Perhaps this is just the way my brain works, but immediately I go to the kind of Oxbridge kind of red brick building where it's like, right, we've got a big biodiversity in fucking Latin that's across the top of it or some shit like that. But that's just the way my brain works. Like I fully understand that, more likely than not, we'd probably have learning to draw something like that.
Sorry. I think what you see now, right, is like back in the Renaissance, like a lot of times when like people built cathedrals, like no one really knew who built them. And I think you see that now with like Bitcoin, for instance. Like no one knows who really created that institution of like a completely anonymous way of like transacting money. And so I think like nowadays, I think what we should do is like avoid having our libido like siphoned off by like fake institutions that just want to, again, feed the machine. And you see that again with like massive corporations where they take like young men and they just kind of put them into like a little cubicle where you keep feeding like the establishment.
Yeah.
I think power is in being anonymous.
Go on there. You've been trying to talk for ages. Go on.
Well, yeah. As my name gets thrown up there, I could teach you some things in a day, but here's the funny thing about that. Like, I could give you skills that if you faithfully practice them for years, you would become adept with firearms as you constantly came back and asked for advice, et cetera, right? Like my father started taking me to marksmanship matches when I was 13. By the time I was 17, I was quite adept with a rifle. By the time I went to Army college and started learning how to apply that skill, which in itself is quite useless actually against people, then you have to then apply that in the broader context of constantly failing at practicing how to do things as a team and how to use ground and how to use cover and how to use surprise and how to use concentration of force and all of these things. And it's like just to give you kind of a picture of that, I remember watching Saving Private Ryan when it first came out, which was before I joined the Army. And I thought it was really cool, but I had no idea what was happening. After I'd gone through 4 years of training and actually learned how to command a platoon properly, I watched it again, and it was a completely different experience because I now understood things that I didn't even have the framework to understand before. So it's a long process, and it has to be generational. But I think that when you look at how do we change the world, look at the coronavirus and how it transmits. It doesn't transmit by one big atomic explosion. It's one person infecting another person, infecting another person, and so on. And that viral spread of ideology is exactly how Christianity changed the world, not with great men, but with individual people empowered with an idea that shared it with another person and then another person. And each one of those people was inflamed with a desire to share this great thing that they held. They couldn't, it's the light on the hill, or, the city on the hill that has to be spread out, has to be seen, has to invite people in. And you have to embody the idea. You have to grow in your own maturity of the idea. And then you have to start mentoring other people. And I see this all the time in churches. I know I'm going on, but we could be this group of, what do we got here? Like 15, 18 people. And these 18 people could sit here and talk till we're blue in the face. And 20 years from now, we'll still be talking about crazy ideas and nothing will have happened. But if each one of these 18 people in a year has honed their ideas and starts sharing them with one other person or 3 other people, or you take that, max close circle of like 12, like Jesus did, and then which we've now found is psychologically ideal. That's why we function in 10 and 12 man sections in the army. And you take them and you train them and you build them up. And then, in a few years, like 10, they might be mature enough to start doing that themselves. And that's how these things change, anonymously, but powerfully and virally.
Yeah.
My thought.
You're absolutely correct.
Hallelujah.
Absolutely correct. I think we're going to be careful with this Hungarian takeover. He'll be like, oh, swoop in. And this is a great point. And like, it's again, this will be a huge, it's always a huge issue with this stuff, is that propensity towards idealism versus practical and down to earth and just like, getting in the hands in the dirt and all that stuff. Like, I've been thinking about this stuff for ages, but I realized that like I can talk about it as much as I want, but I'm kind of thinking about practical goals, like getting a decent, well sung song out is actually a massive step forward for me. And that's something that like I'm always trying to work on. Another one I'd love to do is to try and make a decent level animation of the Red Book. I think that would be a very, very interesting achievement, because that's a proof of like, all right, well, we could produce an actual film experience for people, and that will require a team, and then you can go from there and build on top of that. And like as I've started doing that, I've seen that there's some dudes out there, like Sam's one of them, man. Sam, you got to start showing the lads your stuff. Like, it's fucking, you've got talent and all that, and it's just about getting that like produced, you know what I mean? And I'm not sure how we all fit into that. Like, maybe that's largely an individual thing, and the Boyles will be loosely affiliated and supporting that. Maybe we turn into teams together where we division of labor and all that stuff. But it's but it comes down to stuff like that, and taking those little baby steps as ourselves, and understanding that there is something about a sort of united general perspective, not necessarily ideology, but we are looking at the world similar enough. We're seeing similar enough things, and that's actually almost all you need is that you just need to be in possession of a sort of a truthful perspective, at least an honest perspective, or maybe a sincere, authentic perspective with yourself, and you actually have an immense amount of power to work with a lot of different people. So I think I've said everything I wanted to say about this stuff, because this is a fascinating topic, and it really covers a lot of you dudes would have came from the ion thing. I think this is actually a brilliant add-on to that notion of what ion meant and all that stuff. But is there any other thoughts or anything you've been thinking about?
Just briefly, I wanted to very quickly to anybody who is thinking about anything creative, really. I mean, like for me, it was writing. I'd had a story in my mind for the best part of, I'd say 5 or 6 years, something like that. And it was Steph really that helped me to get that out. I mean, it's still shit, don't get me wrong. It's still shockingly bad. But I have a first draft completed now. And it was a first draft not only completed, but it was completed in roughly 10 weeks. And to me, it was it was one of the most bizarre things in the world, because as the story progressed and as the character changed, I myself changed as a person as well. And that sounds really woo-woo. It sounds fucking gay and all that kind of stuff. But there's genuine emotion behind it as well. And one of the things that I've found that since that has happened, I now have the confidence to address some of the other problems in my life, which were largely creative. And I now have the energy to address them because all of the stress that was involved in my head surrounding this story is now just gone.
Yep, it's amazing. It's amazing.
And the thing is that when you first start the process, you don't realize quite how complex the issue was until you get to the end and can look back at the beginning. And I've probably done a terrible job at explaining that, but
you're all good.
Everybody who's got something that they want to do, I would, especially considering now that we're in a community where we have people who can hold us responsible, I would recommend finding someone who you don't mind communicating with on it, because me and Steph were generally in communication on a daily basis for the most part. I would recommend that you find someone who can do that for you, so that when the issues arise around you not wanting to do the work or not understanding exactly what the next step would be, they can, if not tell you a direction to go, at least kind of mitigate some of the stresses that you have, and you will be amazed the kind of shit that you can get done, like genuinely amazed. And yeah, that's it really.
But this is 100% what I'm trying to talk about, is that, like, you know, there's this mind here, and then there's the deep mind, and it is charged with all this like emotion and energy and even negativity in some point. And if you can let it out, it can heal you in the fucking weirdest ways possible. And like Sam's a great testament to that. Like, he's a man with talent, but like us all, we have like challenges with that stuff. And I went through the same stuff. And when you pull it out, it actually does change you. It is you can only describe it as a spiritual experience. It is that type of stuff. But let's look at wrapping it up. I actually would just like to bounce around and just ask the boyos, have you any thoughts, any ideas, any notions? And then we'll look at that.
Yeah, could I add one thing? I'll try to bring together a couple ideas that were talked about before, but got lost, I think. I don't know if I'll succeed at this, but I've been thinking of the idea of like revelation versus reason as a sort of right brain, left brain thing. And earlier we were talking about like the founders of Rome or superheroes. And I remember that like in Batman and Superman, they always say that they want to become a symbol. And that when they become a symbol of hope or justice or whatever, then they become a superhero. And when I was thinking about revelation versus reason, I was thinking about stories and how stories are, they resonate on multiple levels, and they're very complex, and they're multi-layered. They're almost like three-dimensional. And when someone tries to explain a story, it seems like they're using something different, like reason, and they have to, and where the story is sort of like a symbol, because there's all these complexities. When they use reason, they have to use systems which are sort of like a sign, like one-to-one correlation. This means this, which is why it takes so long to like analyze, let's say, one verse from the Bible. And I found that, that's when I made a breakthrough in my own writing last summer, because I used to sit down and I try to plot it out. And so I was using what I'm trying to call now reason. And I decided, screw that, I'm just going to write. And that is what I'm trying to call revelation, where it's like the whole picture comes to you at once, encapsulated in one thing. And that's the more complex, perhaps right brain type of thinking.
Yeah. And that's absolutely perfect for what we're talking about here, is that like that's genuinely the experience I see so much. And like I even talk about Dostoevsky, people love him, and you can actually look at Dostoevsky as a philosopher. Nietzsche saw him that way, but he describes, he thinks with his right brain, if you want, with his revelationary side of him, his dreaming mind, to make it more romantic. And so instead of him saying like, oh, what would a Christian versus a nihilist be? Well, the Christian would be this, this, and this, and this. No, instead he turns the Christian into Mishkin, I think. Then he gets the nihilist, who's the sharp, like intelligent, like Luciferian character, and he has them both enact a play against each other, and that's him, you know, walking through an experiment and all that. I mentioned this in my last video. If you didn't see it, it's that same thing. Is that someone will think, all right, what is the bigot, what is the professor, what is the capitalist, and they'll like equals this jargon if you want, and then the correct approach to teach someone how to think is actually to get them to paint a picture and show them how to see. It actually starts with seeing more than anything. And that's absolutely true. And it plays a lot into what we're trying to say here. If you want to do this stuff right, you need to be having this idea of like, it's almost like on a technical level, how do you be an artist? That's the first problem for most of us. It's not necessarily what's the perfect ideology. It's more like what's the correct tools for bringing myself out, and that actually is tied to a lot of what you need in terms of a perspective, because that's tied to a lot of what is wrong in terms of the world. So yeah, that's a great point. Thank you very much.
You can even think of it as the symbol writing the story, like in a strict Jungian sense. I know it's flipping it on its head, but that's the proper revelation. If you look at it through analytical psychology.
I'd roll with that, because it's just it becomes a lot more interesting when you look at stuff like this neo-reactionary stuff, and you see that they're basically suggesting that the tides, like Ion is the same, the tides of history are getting driven by, you know, Christ and Satan coming up with their theses of the world, and then you find yourself at a moment in history on that arc, and there's fuck all you can do about it. Like you can't purity spiral and wish that you lived in Rome, even though I'd love to. You can't do it. And the thing is that you have to accept you live in your current reality. And the best thing you can do is actually dig into your mind and, you know, have the revelation. And then you realize that these forces are acting in your mind as well as in the world. And then you start to realize, wait a second, am I telling my own story? Or am I letting these motherfuckers tell their story through me? And that becomes an interesting thought. All right, that becomes an interesting thought. So yeah, but, great point. Any other notion
on that? Best comparative religion books I've ever found. Ravi Zacharias did a little series of short little books where he just created conversations between Jesus and like Buddha, for example. So he just says, okay, well, let's imagine. So I read this story about a prostitute who got AIDS and, you know, slept with a whole bunch of guys anyway because she had to survive, and then burnt herself alive in her house. Let's imagine that both Buddha and Jesus are talking to her, and let's just have that conversation, and, you know, before she decided to kill herself, and let them talk to her about her circumstance. And it's some of the most brilliant, compelling explanation of the differences between these two religions and their take on suffering in life that I've ever seen, and it's only probably 50 pages long. So yeah,
I think I've come across that. That's a pretty profound I guess story, and he says it in a sermon. You can find it on YouTube. He kind of overlies it, and yeah, it's a pretty powerful story. The embrace in the cell, is that what you're talking about?
I think that's probably a different take on it, but he wrote about 5 of these, I think. But anyway, yeah, same principle, I'm sure.
It's very compelling.
Maybe we could look into who else is here? What's going on?
I'm reminded by the story of Moses, actually. A lot of the points that you brought up, Enkidu and Steph, a lot of stuff you were talking about of leading out the kingdom within you and making it manifest instead of trying to program it. You see that throughout the life of Moses. You know, he was you kind of have that foreshadowing of him. He's on the raft, he's on the water, he's kind of riding out the waves as he escapes the tyranny. And he was brought up in this tyrannical state of Egypt, the Pharaoh's state. And you see this ideas of, well, he was properly educated, he had been trained and programmed by the tyrannical state. And early on in his life, when he came across his Israelite brothers, he just straight up was possessed by rage and he fucking killed them. You know, kind of like that Achilles in rage, I think you can say. And which is like, okay, no, you're not supposed to do that. And then throughout his life, he's drawn out of the city. He's drawn into the desert and then kind of forced to kind of fast for long periods of time, you know, drop down his conceptions. You see it embodied in him taking off his sandals and kind of encountering this force that was in him, that was speaking to him. You know, he comes in contact with God. And this pattern is repeated across the whole story of Exodus as he starts to lead people into freedom and learning to live this more holistic experience. And it's quite interesting. I even remember, I remember exactly where, but Moses says, like, God, I'm not going to go address Pharaoh. He's like, well, you're going to go to Pharaoh, Moses, and you're going to, you know, talk shit to him, and I'll guide you. And Moses is like, but I'm a slow man. I'm stupid. I'm not articulate. I don't know what to say, you know. And it's kind of reminds me of that. You talked about writing, how it's learning to kind of let these things lead themselves out of you through this stripping all these layers away, all this programming away. And it's kind of interesting. I thought about that.
I think anybody with a heavy Christian slant should replace all the words I'm using with the notion of the Holy Spirit, because there's this very interesting passage in the Bible, in the Gospels, where, no, it could be after the Gospels, with Saint Stephen. And I think he says the exact same thing. I don't know what to do. I'm not articulate or intelligent enough. And I think there's this emphasis that it's like, I will be there. The Holy Spirit will be there with you when you need it. And then he goes into a courtroom and he just fucking tears them a new one. You know, he like, they're like, we're like, deny Christ. And he's like, no, and you're all liars and hypocrites and all this. And it's like, he gives himself over to a deeper power. And in many senses, I'm describing, like, I guess what I'm trying to describe is the modern scientific view of the mind that gives you permission to believe in these words again, these ideas. Like the Holy Spirit is what happens when you open that portal into the dream and mind, and it starts to supply you with like immense amounts of charged juice that you get to spread into the world. And you kind of have to take a view that that's generally quite positive as well. It is redemptive. Maybe it might be a bit crazy, chaotic, and dark, but it's definitely redemptive on some level. And absolutely, man, that's a great take. That's a great take. Any other thoughts?
And that's
Nick, Luke, Josh, Jeremiah, Kevin. Jeez, we have a load of bio right there. Sorry,
and that's
James,
the red book. Jung let the symbol and the personality or sub-personalities, who bodies come out of him. Then he spent the rest of his life reasoning through it.
Absolutely. Like
it's also that spoke Zarathustra.
Yeah, absolutely, dude. That's actually something to really keep in mind, is that when you do it once, it actually tends to last a long time. Like, you know, like I did all that dream reading, and I'm still processing most of those ideas. Like, I think some of those ideas that I kind of cracked in that stuff were just correct. They just keep on getting reinforced. Like, I had dreams of about this like giant machine, like almost like a spider that would take over the world and all this stuff. And I'm looking around me right now being like, fuck, man. This was definitely going on. So yeah, that's how good stuff. Maybe that's a bit basic, Richard. I don't know. Any other thoughts before we wrap it up, gents?
I don't know if y'all touched on it beforehand, but I know I know one of y'all mentioned the red book, but I know like when he's talking about the magician, and he's talking about reason and unreason, and he says that the only way to learn magic is through unreason, and you don't even really learn it; you just possess it.
I have that bookmarked.
Because learning it would be reason, comprehending it would be reason.
Yeah. It's almost like the notion of Jung always brings up the idea of the shadow, and like, again, to just shill my perspective on this, like I always say, what, you know, the left brain makes the palace of jargon, and that forms this coherent logic that makes sense to you. And in order for you to actually overcome that palace, you need to start to develop a sarcastic, trickster attitude towards your own reality. You need to stop taking yourself serious. You need to start being less arrogant, because that actually, the palace comes along with arrogance in the weirdest way possible. And you need to start subverting it. That would be like the trickster, and that would be like, as we could say, unreason. Like, what's the opposite of this truth? You see that a lot with places like, you know, the bowels of the internet. What do they call it? 4chan and all that stuff. Like, it's just radical free expression that's absolutely like, you know, it's just like dumping manure onto a garden, but that actually makes the garden very fertile. but it is like just letting out the darkness of human nature in that type of sense, and it becomes very generative for ideas, because it's almost like the shadow, the dark side, the lack of reason, the just sheer, like, let the instincts come out, let the emotion come out, let the madness come out, let the sarcasm, the humor, all these type of things. And
learn to make memes.
Yes. And that's
It's helped. It's legit actually helped me in some ways. I joke about it, but it's helped me organize my thoughts when I have a meme idea, just kind of making it anyway.
Yeah, it makes you think, because if you're going to explain an idea too much, and I'm definitely fucking guilty of this, you kind of kill it. But if you can just capture it in like a flash, that actually tends to be closer to maybe how it wants to live or something like that. So
that's easier said than done, though.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, so this kind of, the left started as this trickster who throws you off the branch, you know, but the cathedral is at this stage where it's become all dogmatic and circling around their rational arguments and all that. So I think the right approach towards this is not be confrontational, you know, we're talking about that university. So if you are confrontational against the cathedral, you'll become dogmatic and left brain as well, and they will drag you down with them, even if they're going down. It will be like a slow crash, and they will take their enemies with them, you know, like Rome did with the gods and all that. So I guess the right approach is just be creative and play, and yeah, never be overtly. I mean, if you want to talk about them in a negative way, you should probably do it in your private conversations or in real life conversations, and keep the university creative and positive.
You just said their play. I know Jordan Peterson talks a lot about, and many others. My aunt was huge psychologist. She puts her 2 children, my cousins, into this like extremely play-oriented school in the Chicago area. And what her and Jordan Peterson, a lot of people are talking about this, that we're not encouraged to play enough. And so part of what's enforcing this kind of programming the walls, you know, that you talk about Nietzsche, just like an axe, destroying them freaking walls. It's partly programmed into us from the youth to just behave a little bit too much, as opposed to allowing us to play and getting these kind of demons out while we're young. So it's interesting that you mentioned play there.
Yeah. I think that, like, if you're to talk about just like attitude and all that stuff, in terms of the establishment, like, it's so funny that we use the word conservative, because like the quote unquote the left are conservative, like, because they had this huge cultural movement, and they've now established the first principles of reality, and they're now trying to conserve it, and they're now losing a grip on it, because they're lying about a lot of stuff, or they're being hypocritical, and people just instinctively notice that stuff. And what happens is, like, a lot of people just want to play, they want to have fun, they want to laugh and all that, they want to just be stupid. And then someone comes in and be like, you can't laugh, be fun, or do stupid things around here.
That's
and
offensive.
Then that causes, like, yeah, and that actually really, like, quirks everyone's mind. You're like, wait a second, what do you mean I can't? Who are you to tell me that? I thought you were the radical rebels. Like, I thought you taught, and they're all saying they're like the counterculture and all that. And they're like conservative establishment at this point, conserving the status quo. So it's a very, very interesting idea, absolutely. And it's about the energy, more than anything, has to just be funny.
And the conservatives are really libertarian now too. They're more focused on liberty and things that used to be really, I would say, progressive ideas.
Yeah. We were talking about that earlier. I think you only popped in there in the last 40 minutes or so, but I'll probably post this video up somewhere, depending on what the boyos think, if there's any disagreements, and then you'll be able to see what we were talking about before that. On that note, I might call the recording here. I'll tell you all, thank you very much. We can stop from there. Sure, this might be up on one of the channels, so we'll say hello all the boyos on YouTube. I hope you're enjoying. By all means, we have these chats every now and again, so if you want, I'll figure out a way to, maybe I'll leave in a link in the description or something, and I'll leave it a way for you to get on board. You can join them on one of these if you are juicy, if you're bringing the juice, and if you're not a jargonite, and if not, well, sorry, I'll see you later. And I'm going to call it there, people. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Boom.
Ciao.